Thank you, Kaylee, for that weather update. And that's right, this is a little bit of a impromptu roundish without a table conversation around the Inflation Bill Act that got passed not too long ago. And there seems to be a lot of discussion around what it's going to do, when it's going to do it, and how much is it going to do it by. And so getting started with it, one of the first things that we got a headline here, the first part of it, let's get into the 15% corporate minimum tax. That seems to be one of the headline items that's going to be looking to really kind of curb inflation potentially. So, Tony, let's start off with you. What are some of your initial takeaways from looking at this bill?
I mean, some of it, just looking at some of this, right? If you think about how the government reacts, right? How they generate revenue is just in taxation. But I mean, if you start looking at earnings reports and things like that, I mean, these companies are paying 25% tax already. So what does making it 15% minimum really do? I mean, I guess it's like, what does this actually do, and like the timeline of it? I mean, it's like, if we're trying to fight inflation now, like a lot of these things that I've seen in this are talking 2023, 2024, 2025 into 2030. I mean, does this mean that we're going to see inflation at these levels until some of this stuff comes in? Or is this going to not cause inflation? Or does it actually truly fight inflation? I think that's going to be the key. And I just think where we're kind of at in the timeline, it's like this isn't necessarily what caused the inflationary pressures. I don't think it helps them either.
Thomas, when you're looking at the overview, just at a high point, what are going to be some of the sticking points that really kind of jump out at you initially?
I think when we're talking especially about, first, the Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of the inflation has been tied into energy prices, so I don't see a lot mentioned there. So the ESG initiatives are interesting. We have a lot of wind, solar, other, great ideas, by the way. Let's put more money. Let's do incentives. We forget nuclear. Where's nuclear energy? Come on, people. There's a lot of cool things. Gen 4, I think Bill Gates co-sponsored a company that does the little portable ones that they're starting to get approval for. But it's remarkable, and I think that I need more information, but a lot of these green activism and stuff, they're finally turning around to the fact that nuclear energy is one of the only forms. We're not seeing a lot of that. So that's what's extremely weird. That popped out to me. And the second one was the $400,000 protecting families under 400 grand. I mean, if I lived on a coastal city, but if 400 grand in Tennessee, kind of like a McMansion or something somewhere. So I'm curious about who's actually getting the benefits, because, median income in the U.S. can be between 60 and 80,000 for a household. And we're talking I'm going to protect you up to $400,000. So those are the two things. The third one was 87,000 IRS agents hired. It's an army of bureaucrats almost. So it's interesting. I don't know what's going to happen with that, but those things stuck out.
Yeah, the one that stuck out for me definitely was the hiring of so many IRS agents. When we're looking at that, I have a bit of a hot take around it. So when we're looking at what's going to be needed in the future and what might happen, one of the big areas that got really kind of pointed out and is continuing to kind of start to get pointed out is the import tax that we have right now, especially with China, and how that has not been released. I think if we were to get rid of that, the U.S., in a sense, would essentially lose a bit of income, in a sense. If you look at a grand scheme of things, how can they bring that income back by a lot of IRS agents being able to audit a lot of Americans potentially? Not saying that's going to be a one-to-one trade-off, but I do see this as a potential bonus for the U.S. government when you're looking at being able to audit a lot more individuals throughout the U.S., especially that middle income class.
Yeah, I think that goes into that protecting the 400,000. They say it's not going to raise taxes on those people, but if you're getting audited regularly now, as opposed to, I've done my own taxes for a while now, and they aren't that complicated, but it's very easy to mess it up. And if you're going to sit there and get audited, does it really protect you? Because then it becomes a battle with the IRS and what you actually owe and things like that. So I think it's because when you start thinking about say you get audited and hey, you actually owed $200 more. Well, people can rely on some of that $200, like a tax return, around that time. That's a really good boost for consumer spending. And if now you start having audits and those tax returns get minimized, guess what? It takes away that consumer spending, or I don't want to say takes it away, but it can curb some of that activity.
That's a curb. I guess that's the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm going to tax you more, so you have less income, and then you buy less items, so we have fixed inflation, because that's what it feels like, raising taxes. It's interesting. You snuck it in there. You said we're going to reduce inflation, but the corporate tax changes. That's going to be extremely interesting to watch. I liked your comments on China because we've finally come to the realization that a lot of the stuff we've been purchasing and keeping a deflationary pressure has been with the zero COVID policies in China. There's a lot of structural issues that I feel this bill fails to address because we have structural problems within the supply chain and the globalized system that I don't think anyone's talking about, and we should be.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's, I mean, if you start looking at what caused a lot of the inflation from this, it's government spending with the stimulus packages. I mean, we're talking record numbers of spending, and what was it, like 50% of all money in circulation was printed within the last 2 years or something like that. And then the supply chain issues. I mean, those are the two big ones. And I mean, obviously, oil and gas, energy prices, like that's a big driving factor of inflation. But they also move on a market, right? Like crude oil moves. It's a free, I don't want to say free market because it's not, but I mean, it's traded like a commodity, or it's a traded commodity. So I mean, that price fluctuates regularly, kind of like truckload. I mean, we talked about spot rates earlier on Carrier Update, but I think that's one of those issues, like as these kinks in supply chains work themselves out and we advance, I think that's naturally going to work. That inflationary pressure is going to work itself out. I don't think you need a bill that doesn't actually touch any of those issues to say we're going to reduce inflation.
I think that's a great point. And one of the ones that sticks out for me, of course, that corporate minimum tax. Tom, you had a great point there around a lot of businesses really paying a lot more than that initially. When I first think about this, I think about it in the sense of, say, hey, I'm living in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Say I make $50,000 a year. Now, say my taxes get increased by 15%. Now that means in my mind, I need to make a little bit more money just because I'm going to get taxed more in my head. Or I'm going to move out of Tennessee. Do you guys see this as a potential inflationary pressure building for a lot of different businesses now having to make up that revenue somewhere else, or potentially leaving the U.S. because they no longer can operate for here in the U.S. domestically for a competitive rate?
I think there's definitely that possibility. I think what's interesting though is you start looking at all the topics around nearshoring and things like that. It's like we want to move it back, but this almost disincentivizes that. And it's like, hey, we can go. I mean, now, granted, where are you going to go? I mean, this is issues that they have in Europe and in Canada and things like that. So it's like, where do you go to fight, basically combat this? Because the U.S. is still one of probably the best place to do business in the world. But it definitely gives people a reason to think that, for sure.
I completely agree. I mean, even in like an economic term, if I'm losing money and I feel like I'm making less money because of the higher taxes, it's going to sting more. Yeah. It'll sting more if you lose something than make more. Like you said, the corporate tax rate, offshoring, talk about the nearshoring. Ireland and other statuses, there's a huge debate a few months ago or a year ago about the global tax because of these tax loopholes. So the problem is if the U.S. raises their corporate tax rate, now these corporations are going to go to other places because your bottom line to your shareholders, are you going to be in a shareholder meeting and say, yeah, I took that extra 5% tax by staying in the U.S.? You'll get massacred by the board. So, governments are kind of incentivizing with a giant mallet, and sometimes we need a scalpel. And I'm fearful that this Inflation Reduction Act is taking a mallet to a scalpel-sized problem.
I think very well said, Thomas Wasson and Tony Mulvey. Thank you both so much for joining me for this segment. Don't go away. We have more Freightwaves Now coming up right after this break.